What? What? You're making a video, remember? Oh, right. Yeah. I'll get on that.
When the news broke that Twin Peaks would be returning to television after a quarter century, many of us just about burst into flames from sheer excitement. After all, the series had ended with one of the most sequel-baiting cliffhangers in history in a desperate bid to force the network to renew the show, which in a nutshell didn't happen.
But I haven't brushed my teeth yet.
But with the series returning, we're thrilled that all those unresolved plot threads can now be neatly tied up in a perfect bow. Okay, probably not many of us actually thought that, but the third series did actually resolve many of the dangling plot threads. While there was no mention of the fate of Leo Johnson or a clarification as to how Annie was, we did learn that Audrey and Ben Horne both survived their respective injuries. Cooper did escape the Black Lodge, and his doppelganger and Bob himself were defeated. We learned some more about the mysterious Judy and what Lil's blue rose meant, and even what Laura was screaming at in the forest when she met with James, which was a question I doubt any of us even expected to be answered. Indeed, it's one of the more maddening facts about Twin Peaks that sometimes it did make things perfectly clear, which made those parts that were left in obscurity all the more puzzling. The penultimate episode began with Gordon Cole, David Lynch himself, delivering a long spiel of exposition, and over the next hour we saw the primary villain conquered, we learned where Mr. C's coordinates led, who the weird eyeless woman was, and what had happened to the real Diane, the source of the mysterious noise in the Great Northern, and Cooper's ultimate plan. Absolutely giddy, I went into the final episode fully expecting it to tick off the remainder of the unresolved issues. And that's not what happened. Lynch set up what felt like the beginning of a fourth season and then left us hanging, possibly forever. He said himself that he finds mystery more exciting than resolution, and he's not really wrong. People wouldn't still be writing books about Jack the Ripper if anyone had any idea who the guy was. And one of the most head-scratching mysteries left unanswered was almost certainly what the heck was going on with Audrey Horne, whom had left just as it seemed like answers were about to be given. Thus, it seems like a good place to start this series. Twin Peaks, all questions answered. Pone Flicks makes no guarantee that the answers are correct. Mark Frost's Twin Peaks novel, The Final Dossier, doesn't tell us what was happening, as was to be expected, since that info likely would have been given in the show itself if they'd wanted to divulge it. However, it is very useful in helping to disconfirm certain theories. No, Audrey was not still languishing in a coma following the explosion at the bank in the second season's final episode. She did marry her accountant, as the series indicated. Despite much speculation, he was not her doctor or psychiatrist, though I'll return to a similar thought later. It does suggest she was having psychological problems in the time running up to the events of the return, and one of the behind-the-scenes vignettes appearing on the Blu-ray set confirms that Sherilyn Fenn was performing her final scene in a hospital gown, so make of that what you will. The Audrey story has two major components to discuss, the plot and the theme. The theme, I feel, is actually quite clear, so I'll come to that at the end and focus for now on the plot. At a glance, there doesn't seem to be much of one. She never appears in scenes with any of the other principal characters and only leaves her home at the very end of her story arc. However, certain factors do indicate that her story is not taking place in a vacuum. She tells her husband that she's having an affair with a man named Billy, and that Billy is now missing. The fact that Billy is missing is confirmed by other characters in the course of the series.
Have you seen Billy?
Hey! Has anybody seen Billy?
Even more enigmatically, she makes a cryptic reference to the story of the little girl who lived down the lane, a phrase repeated by the arm in the final episode, which raises some bizarre possibilities. There have been boatloads of wacky theories floating around out there regarding what's happening in this show, so I will try my absolute best to avoid making insane leaps of logic and stick to what can actually be inferred from watching the show. If I ever feel like I'm going out on a limb, I'll say so up front. Now, on the issue of Billy, this was my impression on my first watch, and I've never seen any particular reason to revise it. So here we go. This is Billy. He's the man whose truck was used by Richard Horne in the deadly hit and run of the little boy. We see Andy questioning him about the now returned truck. The man is clearly terrified of being seen talking to the police and arranges to meet Andy elsewhere later in the day. However, he never makes the meeting and we only see an ominous shot of his front door standing open. It seemed quite likely that he had in fact been seen talking to Andy by Richard and had been attacked, his fate unknown. After all, we do see what happens to Miriam for being an eyewitness to the hit and run. And at the end of this episode, another man runs by the Double R and asks if anyone has seen Billy. This suggests strongly that Billy is the character we already know from earlier in the episode has disappeared. It's true that the character in question is never referred to by any name while on screen and is credited only as Farmer. But this strikes me as a case of Lynch being deliberately coy. I mean, even the guy running by asking after Billy got a name. He's done this before in Inland Empire when much was made over who would be playing the character of Smithy in the film within a film.
There's Smithy's house.
Smithy's house.
Who is playing Smithy?
But no character was ever directly identified by that name. We only got a credit for Smithy's son, which allowed us to deduce that Smithy was this man. Why the games? Ask Lynch. He's not going to tell you, but I can't come up with anything better.
Yeah, I won't ask you. You won't tell me.
So working from that premise, the whole phone call to Tina makes perfect sense. Audrey's husband learns that Billy was last seen just after Richard stole his truck and killed a child with it.
What?
After which he seriously hurt Billy. No wonder he won't tell the emotionally unstable Audrey what he knows. Her own son killed someone and then tried to kill the very man she's looking for. Theirs may be a loveless marriage, but this is an act of mercy. We do learn that Billy's truck was stolen and later returned, and he was last seen bleeding from the nose and mouth. The theft is attributed by Charlie to a Chuck.
Did you know that Chuck stole Billy's truck last week?
But it's possible Billy just didn't want to point the finger at Richard. It might also be that Chuck and Richard are working together. If nothing else, Chuck seems to be almost as big an asshole as Richard. So I wouldn't be surprised.
They called Billy, and I guess Billy got his truck back and dropped any charges.
Charges were probably dropped after he found out what had been done with the truck, and he didn't want to paint a big target on his back for Richard's reprisal for being a snitch. But the cops found out whose truck it was, and therefore this confrontation occurred. So to summarize, both this guy and Billy had their trucks stolen, both had the trucks returned, and both mysteriously disappeared on what appears to have been the same day. The inconsistency with blaming Chuck is a little curious, but I say with a very high degree of confidence, this is Billy. Audrey spends almost all of her time at home with her husband, and though she constantly berates him over his desire not to go out, she seems unwilling to do so herself, changing the subject anytime he gives in to her demands, as if she's incapable of leaving or is secretly afraid to. I speculate that the Audrey we see here may, like Diane, be a tulpa, which I think the show hints at in a variety of ways. When her husband made the comment,
Are you going to put your coat on or talk me to death right here on the threshold?
I immediately thought of this scene.
You will meet your own shadow self. My people call it the dweller on the threshold.
Granted, it's perhaps a bit too much to hang on a single word, but there's more. Audrey complains of feeling like she's someone else.
Like I'm somewhere else and like I'm somebody else. Have you ever felt that?
The moment when Diane realizes she's not the real Diane, she exclaims, "I'm in the sheriff's station, I'm not me."
A sheriff's station. I'm not me.
At the end of that same episode, Audrey, who had earlier expressed identical sentiments, suddenly finds herself somewhere else other than where she thought she was. What little we see of the real Diane depicts a person very different from her double, who is perpetually irritable, combative, and frightened. Audrey was always a bright, vivacious, and extroverted person. Now she's perpetually irritable, combative, and frightened. Both characters share a piece of dialogue with the arm, implying a connection to the Black Lodge.
Let's rock.
Is that the story of the little girl who lived on the lake?
The end credits following Audrey's final scene play her theme music in reverse. And on the darker end of things, we know Mr. C assaulted them both. Why might an Audrey tulpa have been created? Like Diane, she was a woman Cooper cared for and confided in, someone who might be valuable as a sleeper agent. After all, Mr. C put no fewer than 3 assassins on Cooper's trail and triple-checked the coordinates he sought before investigating the location. He was nothing if not thorough. The Blue Rose Task Force approached Diane, but not Audrey, who was left to her own devices. So what are we to make of the line she shares with the arm? The little girl who lives down the lane is the name of a 1976 Jodie Foster thriller/drama about a child living on her own whilst keeping up the illusion that she's living with her parents, who are both actually dead. Amongst other problems, she has to fend off predatory advances from the adult son of her landlady, somewhat paralleling Laura Palmer's travails. And without trying to give too much away, let's just say she navigates this conflict more successfully than Laura did. When the arm asks Cooper in the final episode, is this the story of the little girl who lived down the lane, it may be his way of asking, is this the version of the story where the little girl survived her ordeal? Cooper has changed events, so now Laura avoids her death and goes on to escape Twin Peaks. Like the little girl, she must now make her way in the world without her parents. The final dossier confirms that Laura was considered a missing person, not a murder case, after Coop's intervention. How then does this relate to Audrey? She mentions this in relation to Charlie saying he may have to end her story.
What story is that, Charlie?
The line gave the episode its name, so it's pretty safe to say it's important. I would say it's the story of Audrey's freedom and independence, which may have to come to an end. Based on the unchanging clothes between the scenes, it would appear that all of the Audrey scenes happen in the course of one night, when she seems desperate to visit the Roadhouse, and yet keeps changing the subject whenever Charlie seems willing, referring to her home as like Ghostwood.
It's like Ghostwood here.
Viewers will remember that Ghostwood Forest was the vast tract of land that Catherine Martell and Ben Horne argued over and fought for control of during the course of the original series. But here the final dossier comes in handy again, as it indicates that after finally acquiring the land, Ben Horne used it to build a for-profit prison where a certain Warden Murphy worked for a time, which was the final breaking point for Audrey where her father was concerned. In this context, the line suddenly makes sense. She's likening her home to a prison. In fact, this clarifies so much I'm tempted to think that Ghostwood Prison may have originally been mentioned in the show, but was eventually cut out. Behind-the-scenes features on the Blu-ray do show the filming of some scenes we never saw used, so it is at least possible. So what is Audrey's issue with the Roadhouse? She claims it's a place Billy hated, but still wants, and yet doesn't want to go there, going so far as to imply she doesn't know where it is.
Is it far?
Come on, Audrey. You know where it is.
Maybe the place she finally goes to is not the Roadhouse, but the Nut House.
That's because you're hanging out at the Nut House.
This girl being advised to quit hanging around the Nut House is the daughter of Tina, whom Audrey seems to hate, and who makes Charlie promise not to tell Audrey what she knows about Billy. While Charlie is unlikely to be Audrey's doctor or therapist, what about Tina? Listen to this conversation and picture a man talking to his wife's doctor or therapist.
Yes, Tina, it's Charlie. How are you? Yeah? Yeah, I know. Sorry to call so late.
I heard you were the last person to see Billy.
I know, my mom and him had a thing.
What? Really?
Yeah, up until pretty recent, at least.
Until recently, because that's when Audrey entered the picture. And that's probably why Tina and Audrey don't care for each other terribly much.
I won't. I promise.
Tina is protecting Audrey from harmful information.
You're not gonna tell me what she said?
Out on a limb? Quite possibly. But it's something to think about. It's clear at any rate that Audrey isn't really at the Roadhouse, as in a scene which again winkingly acknowledges Twin Peaks' fictitious nature, has the MC announce Audrey's theme music by its name as it appears on the Twin Peaks soundtrack.
Audrey's Dance.
This is her mental construct of better days when she was young and carefree, which leads me into my final observation. While her connection to the plot is vague and uncertain, her theme couldn't possibly be clearer. In fact, Charlie pretty much hits the nail on the head when he tells her,
This is Existentialism 101.
For Audrey, she'd suffered the worst indignity that a person like her could possibly suffer. She grew up. That bright, charismatic, self-determined girl from the original series has, in a word, settled. The infinite possible paths that lay before her as a young person have been replaced by the single path that she did take. Anyone expecting that the new series would be about Coop and Audrey falling into each other's arms and consummating that love that once was too morally questionable to embrace has clearly been reading too much fan fiction. Twin Peaks: The Return has taken us back to the very first episode's mission statement. This show is fundamentally a tragedy. If Laura Palmer's story was the tragedy of dying young, then Audrey's story is the far more commonplace and banal tragedy of not dying young.
You're getting older and your prison's in your mind, and who am I, and what are the choices that I've made, and why, maybe revisiting some time when you thought that you were free, but you're still dancing there in a prison.
The lyrics to the song Eddie Vedder is singing when Audrey finally shows up at the Roadhouse or wherever tell the whole story of one day being forced with the shocking question of, who is that old person in the mirror?
I stare at my reflection to the pole. Blurred eyes look back at me, full of blame and sympathy, so close. A right road's not taken, the future's forsaken, dropped like a fossil lost.